Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances. The Russians have advanced near Terni along the Serpets river line. They advanced south of the Siversk direction. The Russians have also advanced along the Pokrovsk defensive lines in the direction of Kurakhove, as well as in the Vremevsky Ledge area, where the Russians are now working on additional encirclements following the closure of the previous ones. Starting out in the Vremevsky Ledge direction, the Russians have managed to encircle the Ukrainian forces near Makharivka, where they have managed to cut off the road connecting Makharivka to Storozheve, while at the same time they are exerting heavy pressure on Storozheve with their positions across the river line, and they're fighting along the fortified positions of the Ukrainians to the northwest of Storozheve, pushing towards Neskushne to cut off Storozheve and encircle that settlement as well. So they're working on two encirclements at the same time. The Ukrainians are now in a position where they could potentially resupply or withdraw from Makharivka, but due to the close proximity of the Russian forces on both flanks, both near the first lines along the main road, their positions in Blahodatne direction and to the west of Makharivka, they'll be able to exert direct fire on the Ukrainian forces withdrawing or resupplying their positions in Makharivka. This means that if there are any Ukrainian forces remaining in Makharivka, which there likely are, considering there's been no indication of a withdrawal, the Ukrainian forces there would be unable to withdraw and would now either have to fight to the end, wait for a breakout by additional reinforcements arriving, or to surrender to the Russian forces. This way, the Russians are bypassing several fortified positions of the Ukrainians by hitting their supply lines and cutting off their withdrawal. We're seeing a clear change in the Russian tactics, and I believe it is due to the lack of Ukrainian withdrawals. The Ukrainians have so far refused to withdraw from several encirclements, and therefore the Russians have decided to move on to complete encirclements of Ukrainian forces to completely cut off any sort of supply and then move through. The Russians have made several encirclements across the southern Donetsk region over the past few weeks. There was the encirclement south of Kurakhove, the encirclement in the southern parts of Kurakhove, the encirclement here near Velyka Novosilka, the encirclement north of Kurakhove, and now additional encirclements and cutting off the supplies. For example, the Russians have moved through to push towards Selenivka, reaching the outskirts of the settlement. This combined with the presence of Russian forces in the north near Saritsoni can allow for an entire encirclement of the entire section here from Selenivka in the west to Dashna in the east, cutting off the supplies and reinforcements going in or out of this area. So a large pocket near Kurakhove, while at the same time we see the double encirclement here near Makharivka and Storozheve, where they will continue pushing upwards towards Vremivka. Cutting off the road here west of Vremivka would also cut off and encircle Velyka Novosilka, Vremivka and Neskushne. As we see, the Russians have re-entered Novye Komar and are fighting within the settlement there as well. Therefore, we can conclude that the Russians are seeing a lot more success now than they were doing weeks ago, based on the increase in pace and size of the encirclements of Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian inability to free up their forces once encircled. The Ukrainian positions here in the southern Donetsk region seems to become weaker and weaker as the days go by. They need significant reinforcements by their own side if they want to secure their positions here in the southern Donetsk region. Otherwise, the Russians will gain full control over the southern region within the next few weeks. With the Russian push towards Selenivka, they are following the capture of Sukhyali, moving further up along the Sukhyali river. The Russians are here attempting to move along the river line to reach the main highway west of Kurakhove. The Ukrainians are putting up significant resistance here in the northern flank of Kurakhove, preventing the Russians from making any significant breakthroughs or cutting off the road west of Kurakhove. Now the Russians are making an additional attempt through the southern flank to move towards Konstantinopel, Rosliv, Ulekli, and Selenivka. At the same time, with the capture of Spinivka, it is likely that the Russians will start pushing along the northern bank of the river line as well towards Yantarne, cutting off the remaining parts of Konstantinopolsk and reaching Dashne and Kurakhove from the south. With the control of the apartment complex area in the southern parts of Kurakhove and the majority of the western parts of Kurakhove as well, there may appear new offensive operations by the Russians in between the fortified positions towards Dashne, where they'll bypass the industrial zone where the Ukrainians will likely hold up within. Further north, on the southern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians have advanced towards Ukrainka, capturing an additional fortified position and getting closer towards the settlement following the capture of Pushkina. We see that there is this road connecting here Novosilka in the east to Ukrainka in the west. With this, the Russians continue offensive operations along the main road towards Ukrainka, while at the same time, with the capture of the fortified positions northeast of Ukrainka, west of Pushkina, the Russians can develop offensive operations towards Novosilka as well, where there's this road connecting Pushkina to Novosilka, where they can attack from the eastern direction. So there's pressure on the eastern flank, while at the same time the Russians are also advancing from the northern direction, from Toretsk down towards Novosilka and Ukrainka from the main highway, connecting Pokrovsk in the north with Kurakhove and Velyka Novosilka in the south. Near Toretsk, the Russians have advanced west of the settlement, capturing the remaining parts of their forest lines, securing the western flank of Toretsk for further offensive operations in the western, northern, or southern direction, where they'll have a secure flank. They'll likely move along the forest lines to the west and along the main highway towards Novosilka, flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians and capturing the settlements along the highway. The fighting in the Pokrovsk section of the front line is moving in a northwestern direction. As previously mentioned, the Russians are moving to capture the supply lines west of Pokrovsk, cutting off the highways towards the Dnipro region, while at the same time flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians from their weak points and gaining control over the settlements in the western parts to potentially launch offensive operations into the Dnipro region, or to continue the flanking maneuver and encircle Pokrovsk. In either case, putting all your eggs in one basket and only flanking the left-hand side will make it difficult for the Russians to succeed with such an operation. Therefore, we will likely see additional fighting here in the eastern parts, where the Russians will look to gain control over Myrnohrad here in the east of Pokrovsk. This settlement here is a position which is very heavily fortified, similar to Pokrovsk. It also has several areas within it that can be used as defensive positions, and with its close proximity to Pokrovsk, it is well supplied. Additionally, the Russians have two positions south and east of the settlement from which they can attack it from, along the railways between Hrodivka and Myrnohrad, as well as from Hrodivka towards Myrnohrad. Both of these locations are blocked by fortified positions of the Ukrainians, and the southern district here is separated by the northern district from an apartment complex area, which is very shallow. This means that it can act as a choke point with the high ground overview, as well as the waste heap here to the southeast of Myrnohrad, which can act as an overview point where they can put on cameras and such, similar to Toretsk. Therefore, Myrnohrad is a very heavily fortified position, which will be difficult for the Russians to gain control of. In the southern outskirts of Myrnohrad, we see additional apartment complex buildings. These are much less dense and far in between, but with the fortified positions, these positions are defendable. It is likely that the Russians will have a much easier time gaining control over the southern parts until the choke point than it is to move upwards towards the following parts through the choke point and into the northern parts of Myrnohrad, where there are a lot more apartment complex areas. It is well fortified and heavily defensible positions. But it was likely going to be a scenario where the Russians will be flanking Pokrovsk from the west, where they will look to gain control over a wide area and cut off the majority of supply lines, while heavy fighting will continue in the Myrnohrad direction simply to redirect Ukrainian forces from the western flank to the eastern flank, and both will see a lot of fighting. Moving on to the Siversk section of the front line, we see a Russian advance south of Velyka along the railways. The Russians are here expanding the zone of control north of Velyka to generally push the Ukrainian forces out of the area. The Ukrainians are constantly launching drones and other things from this area, where they can, from the rear of the Russian forces, attack them from multiple directions. This makes it difficult for the Russians to launch additional offensive operations in this direction, and therefore the Russians are looking to gain control over the forest lines and fields here in between Velyka and Rostolivka to secure the southern flank of Siversk and move further along the railways both in the eastern and western direction. The Russians also managed to advance east of Terny, gaining control over the road into Terny from the eastern direction, and with this the Russians will be able to strengthen the offensive operations in this Terny direction with additional supply lines going into the settlement. The Russians here have 3 supply lines into Terny, one from the northern direction, one from the northeastern direction, and now one from the eastern direction. The Russians will likely push along Terny towards Yampolivka along the Serbets river line to gain control over these settlements. However, the Ukrainians have a very strong defensive capabilities in the Liman direction, making it difficult for Russians to make any sort of breakthrough or significant advances in this section of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.